Hi students, it's Dr. Marks, and we're starting with an introduction to Costa Rica. In this particular lecture, we're going to talk about the geography of Costa Rica and the population. So let's get started. Now, as you know, Costa Rica is one of the developing nations in Central America. It's a former Spanish colony, right? That doesn't surprise anyone because you know you're going to a Spanish-speaking country. But you might not realize that it was actually discovered by Columbus in 1502. But it didn't actually gain independence until 1821, along with the rest of Central America. And so clearly we're going to see some roots in Spanish influence. We're going to be seeing people speak in Spanish, but this is a country that has come quite a long way. You're going to see that Costa Rica truly is a country that is innovative. And it's learned from its mistakes. I don't want to mislead you. While we're going to a country that is on the frontier of environmental protection and sustainability, they have had some horrific history where they have cut down forests, just like all over the world, to make room for development of farms and ranches. And they've learned from those mistakes, and now they're a leader in sustainable development. So you're going to learn about the country's ambitious standards for environmental protection, and you're going to learn about its energy independence, because they really have done phenomenal things and have reached incredible levels of energy independence. And it's also a country that has a nationwide environmental ethic. You're really going to get a good sense for that when we're there, that it's not just a few people, it's a country that has all bought into a way of life. And to me, it's a model of what can be done. And I know you're going to be incredibly impressed when you think about that Costa Rica is not a rich country, but yet they seem to have made milestones that our own country isn't capable of making. Now, Costa Rica has maintained peace and democracy for many decades. It's really considered to be an incredibly safe place to go. And it's been this way since 1948. But that's not true of some of the other countries in the region. While we would say that Costa Rica is an incredibly safe place to go, I'm not sure we'd say that about El Salvador and certainly parts of Nicaragua and Honduras, Guatemala. So it's really an outlier when it comes to Central America in so many ways, from income to its green ethic to its safety and its approach to public services. So that's what makes it so innovative, because it's in an area that you don't generally see those kinds of innovations. Now, in 1948, Costa Rica took a bold move. And guys, this bold move really set the stage for propelling their economic development. So what did they do in 1948? Well, they abolished the military. So think about that for a second. If you abolish the military, that is going to allow all of those resources to be redirected, right? Think about if the United States didn't have any military expenses. Think about all the amazing things we can do. Now, of course, their military probably wasn't on a per capita basis as large as ours, and their spending wasn't as large as ours, but still, for a developing country, this is significant. So what did they do with those resources? Well, they put them into education. They put them into the environment and environmental protection, and they put them into healthcare. So those were really the three pillars of where they put money towards when they didn't have to pay for the military any longer. And this bold move has really paid off for Costa Rica. If we look at Costa Rica, compared to its Central American counterparts, we see greater prosperity than most of those other Central American nations. Costa Rica really is a bit of an outlier. And it all comes from what they call the peace dividend. So you're going to hear me refer to this idea of the peace dividend probably over and over, because really a lot of what Costa Rica's been able to accomplish is because they freed up the resources by this abolishing of the military back in 1948. So the peace dividend, it's a good kind of explanation for what has propelled them into economic development. So let's talk about geography. First, when you look at the map, you see that Costa Rica is not a very large country. It's about equivalent to New Hampshire and Vermont if we add those together. So you see that on the map in New England, or slightly smaller than West Virginia. So those both give you some kind of idea. So we're not talking about a very large country. And if you look at it in the map, and you are going to be responsible for learning the map of Central America, and you'll see that in your modules, Costa Rica is, again, pretty small. Now it's not as small as El Salvador. You see that little small pinkish colored nation. But it's pretty small compared to Mexico and Colombia and Venezuela, clearly. Costa Rica is sandwiched between Nicaragua to the north and Panama to the right. Now, I know you guys know a little bit about Panama because you've heard of the Panama Canal. Costa Rica has some border issues with Nicaragua, same kind of immigration issues that we might see here in our own country with the border of Mexico, and we'll talk about that a little bit, but you're probably going to hear more about that when traveling in Costa Rica. For example, we might see coffee pickers, and they're generally not going to be Costa Rican, they're going to be Nicaraguan. Now, it's also important to understand that all of those islands in the Caribbean, that is considered part of Central America, or you might see it referred to as Central America and the Caribbean. They tend to be grouped together. We're going to focus more on the little channel right there between Mexico and Colombia, but we do want to recognize that we have all these islands that are really part of Central America. Now, one thing I love about travel in Costa Rica is that it's such a geographically diverse place. And one thing that makes it so beautiful is this mountain range. And you see this relief map on the left that shows you this mountain range that goes from north to south. And you see an incredible picture of it on the right. And so for us to get anywhere in Costa Rica, we're going to have to be going over the mountains back and forth. And I'm going to point out right now that if you are at all carsick, I would urge you to travel with some Dramamine. In addition, Costa Rica is known for beautiful beaches, and we will definitely be hitting a couple of them. And most importantly, we've got the beautiful wet rainforest. Now, one thing I will tell you is that every time we go to the rainforest, we get, just like you would expect, rain. So this is an area where you're going to need your raincoat or your ponchos. It could be very drizzly, not torrential downpours, but drizzly, and that's what makes it so beautiful and tropical. But then you've also got the cloud forests. And if you're not familiar with a cloud forest, it's really just a high elevation rainforest. And so we're going to be doing some trekking in the rainforest and the cloud forest. We'll have a naturalist guide who will be able to point out beautiful things. And hopefully, if we're really quiet, we'll also see some animals. Let's talk about the demographics of Costa Rica. Costa Rica has a population in 2023 of 5.25 million. And that by itself may not really give you a good sense of it, other than it's just a lot of people. So let's compare it to Virginia. And I couldn't get a 2023 measure, but I found one for 2022, 8.68 million people. So we're going to be going to a country that is smaller than our own state. And of course, we've already said it's about the size of West Virginia, so that gives us some idea. If we look at population growth, which is an important element of population dynamics that economists care about, we see a country that has a population growing at 0.98%, right? That's just about 1% a year. And that's high when you compare it to the developed world. We have developed countries that have zero population growth or maybe even negative population growth. When I looked at the United States last, it was somewhere around 0.6%. So this is high compared to the developed world. but it's also a big improvement over the last several decades. And I'm going to show you a graph of that, and you'll really see the remarkable transformation this country has made. It is important to think about population growth because this is important for economic development. And you may have studied China, for example, in some of your other classes where, if you want to become more prosperous, which China has, you have to get your population growth under control. So population growth being under control is important for countries if they want to develop economically. Now, researchers point to birth rates, and Costa Rica has experienced decreasing birth rates. So let's formally explain what we mean by birth rates. The birth rate is the number of live births per 1,000 people. So if we randomly collect 1,000 people, we want to know how many of them will have a live birth in that year. Now, birth rates aren't going to be humongous numbers, right? Because if we take 1,000 people, some of them are going to be men, right? Well, they're not going to be giving birth to anybody, and some of them are going to be really young, and like children aren't likely to be giving birth, and really old people like me are probably not giving birth, and your grandparents aren't probably giving birth. And so we end up getting really only a small portion of these 1,000 people that are of the right gender and probably the birthing age. And then not all of them are going to have a baby that year. So we'll take a look at some data to get a sense of what the birth rates actually are. But one thing we need to understand is that poor nations generally have high birth rates. Let's think about why. Well, first, in poor countries, they might have lack of access to birth control. If you don't have access to birth control, you're going to end up with more babies. But you also have a lack of access to medical care. And part of that medical care might involve family planning that goes hand in hand with birth control. Poor countries also have high infant or child mortality rates. And so if you live in an environment where the likelihood of your child living is lower, you're likely going to have more children than you would otherwise. But also countries that are agriculturally oriented, some families create their own labor force by having lots of children. So there are lots of reasons that we see poor nations having high birth rates. But specifically, my friends in Latin America also talk about masculine pride in large families, that they suggest is kind of a sense of your manliness to have lots of children. And so there are women who tell me they don't want to have any more children, but their husbands do. And that sometimes creates a little conflict. Now, birth rates will fall with economic development. When we start seeing countries grow economically, birth rates will fall because things like infant mortality rates are going to fall. So if your infant mortality rates are going to fall and the probability that your child will live past a certain age goes up, you're not going to have as many children. But also, as countries grow economically, they have cleaner environments, their citizens start to get access to health care. And of course, women start having fewer children for these reasons, because their children are surviving. With the decrease in infant mortality rates, with the cleaner environment that they're growing up in, with access to health care. You understand that makes sense. But also, women start getting an education when countries start to develop. So when women get an education, like think about you guys, you're probably not married, you probably don't have a child, you're probably not thinking about having a child right now. So when you get an education, it delays having a family. And women are entering the workforce. So probably, for a lot of you, your thoughts of having a family might be several years off. You want to finish college, you want to get a job. And then, of course, as we said, we start seeing access to birth control when countries start to develop. Additionally, when countries develop, they're no longer as agriculture oriented. Now, let's be clear. I'm not saying that Costa Rica in its development is no longer involved in agriculture. They certainly are. But what I am going to be able to show you is that the composition of the industries in Costa Rica has definitely changed, and they are not as agriculturally oriented as they used to be. So families don't need to have lots of kids to build in their own labor force. Let's take a look at birth rates for Costa Rica. And you see here that they have drastically decreased since the 1950s, right? Look all the way to the left of that graph and you see that there were something like 46 live births per 1,000 people, and that is a really high number, folks. But more recently, if you look to the far right side of the graph, you see that this number has dropped well below 15. So we see this continual decline in birth rates, and that makes sense because we also know that Costa Rica has become more prosperous. Now, I'm not saying they are a rich country because that would not be accurate. But if we look over time, the standard of living in Costa Rica has gone up and up and up. And we'll take a look at that when we do a lecture on the economy of Costa Rica. Here is data when we compare birth rates in the region, and the most recent I could find was 2021. But in 2021, you see Costa Rica there in red has a birth rate of 12. But if you compare it to its Central American counterparts, you see other countries with significantly higher birth rates. Belize at 18 and El Salvador at 16, both Guatemala and Honduras, and Nicaragua all at 21. Panama at 18. So Costa Rica has kind of broken away from the pack here, right? And they have seen reduction in birth rates that we're not seeing in some of these other countries. Now keep in mind, some of these other countries aren't as developed as Costa Rica, so they aren't quite in the same place in terms of their prosperity. Clearly, birth rates are going to have an impact on population growth rates. So let's look at this graph of Costa Rica's population growth rates. If we look to the left, right? If we look to the left, we're somewhere around 1960, right? Look how high the population growth rate was for Costa Rica. It's over 3.5%, right? It looks more like 3.6-ish percent back around 1960. That is a really, really high population growth rate, right? That's like what we were seeing in Thailand and China and parts of Africa. But over time, we've seen a significant decrease. And if you look far to the right side of the graph, we get population growth rates that, as we said, are close to 1%. So dramatic changes from 3.6 all the way down to just below 1% right now. I thought you might find it interesting to compare Costa Rica to China because China is a country most people are familiar with, right? China implemented the one-child policy, and that was their strategy to very quickly get population growth under control. But if you look at China, pointing out to the left side of the graph, you should be looking at it going, wait a minute, China initially had negative population growth, and this is due to policies of Chairman Mao, who diverted resources out of food production into mineral production. Wasn't very successful, but it led to a famine. And so that negative growth comes from the famine. But just after that, we start seeing population growth rates in China that are really high, right? In between 2.5% and 3%. That's enormous. They implemented the one-child policy, and we see population growth steadily decline. If you look at Costa Rica at the top, they actually had higher population growth rates than China did, right? But they didn't implement a one-child policy. Instead, they implemented this program of diverting resources into education and environmental protection. They practice sustainability. They've propelled themselves economically. And you see kind of a similar trend. Both countries have ended up with dramatic changes to population growth, but very different approaches. This is a map of the world so that you can put Costa Rica and Central America in perspective. So if you look at the scale in the bottom left, that scale in the bottom left is showing you population growth categories. So if you are in the reds and oranges you're at negative population growth. So you see some negative population growth in Europe, right? You start seeing that. You see it in China as well, right? You've probably heard about their one-child policy kind of started to backfire on them. They moved it to a two-child policy. That didn't work. Three-child policy. They haven't been able to get people to have children. Now you get into the blue areas. So blue is where you're going to see low population growth. So in between 0 and 1%. And so that's a whole lot of the world between 0 and 1%. But then we still have areas of really high growth. You see parts of Africa are definitely plagued by high population growth rates. So Central America is doing well in general, right? They look more like the developed world. They don't have negative population growth rates like we see in parts of Europe, but they are not at 0. So they're in a pretty good situation. I don't want to make it seem like it's only Costa Rica. So let's blow this up, and I've just snipped that middle section so you can see Central America. And remember, the darker colors is higher, closer to the white is lower, close to 0, right? And so Central America has made a lot of strides in reducing its population growth as well. But you do see Costa Rica is a little bit of an outlier, also El Salvador there. So Costa Rica is doing really well in that category. They have seen some success, but Central America has also seen similar trends. If we look at demographics, and I could not get updated information that I thought was good, so I'm going to rely on a little bit older data, but this is okay. I want to give you a sense of kind of the racial mix in Costa Rica, and you see that the bulk of the population is white, or what they call mestizo. So almost 84%. Now, what is mestizo? It's going to be the mixed race between Spanish and indigenous people. Between Spanish and indigenous people. Remember, Costa Rica was a Spanish colony, right? So it makes sense that we're going to have a population of Spanish people who have had children with indigenous people, creating that mixed race. Then we have a population, almost 7%, that is what they call mulatto. So mulatto is going to be the mix between African and European races. You do have an African population, and you especially see that now if you're on the Caribbean side of Costa Rica. We won't get there on some years. We tend to flip back and forth between the Caribbean and the Pacific. So there might be some years we go to the Caribbean, but the Pacific tends to have less problems with torrential rain. And so it's been really problematic on the Caribbean side. So that's why we've been spending more of our time on the Pacific side. Then, of course, we've got the indigenous population, but look how small the indigenous population in Costa Rica is, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Then we've got the Black or African population of being just slightly over 1%. But remember that mulatto population where we see Africans and Europeans who have had children together. And then other races represents a very small mix. So it does have some racial diversity, but the white or mestizo population is clearly predominant. Let's talk about the indigenous people for just a moment. Costa Rica was home to more than 25 different indigenous tribes, and that was before Columbus's arrival in 1502. Now we see a shrinking population of indigenous persons. It's, as we just said a second ago, only about 2.4% of the population. So this is a really very small portion of Costa Rica's population. A lot of people aren't familiar or don't exactly know what we mean when we say indigenous. So before we leave this slide, let's just define it. This is the World Bank definition, and they define indigenous as being people that are distinct social and cultural groups that share collective ancestral ties, and that's important, ancestral ties to the lands and natural resources where they live or that they occupy, or, importantly, from which they have been displaced. So indigenous people are distinct social and cultural groups that share collective ancestral ties to the land and natural resources where they live or that they occupy, or from lands that they have been displaced from. And that last part of the definition is important. For example, I've been leading programs in Ecuador. And when I take people to the Amazon jungle in Ecuador, we visit the Kofani tribes. We go to the Siona tribes. And these are people that have been pushed off of their ancestral lands, some of which by the government because there is oil there. And so some of these indigenous tribes have just kind of been pushed further and further and further back into the Amazon jungle, and they have less and less and less ancestral land. By the way, if you're looking at that beautiful sculpture on the right, this is a Baruca mask, and you will see these in Costa Rica. And there have been years where there's a Baruca artist that has a little stand by the side of the road. He does beautiful work, and the prices are a fraction of what they're going to sell for in souvenir shops. When we see him on the side of the road, if we're lucky enough to catch him, and if we happen to be going by that route, we will stop, and people might have the opportunity to buy some Baruca masks. And they make them of all different sizes, but they are just stunning. If you look in Costa Rica, we said before, a lot more tribes, but there are still a number of tribes left. And the three that I'm familiar with, the Bribris, the Terabas, and the Barucas. And the reason that I'm familiar is these are all tribes that we have visited because, interestingly, indigenous tribes are now opening themselves up for tourism. And it's a great opportunity to have a very culturally immersive experience that would be hard to replicate in a whole lot of other places. If we look at the map, we see these indigenous tribes in the colored sections on the map. Now, they're kind of spread throughout Costa Rica, but especially we see them there kind of along close to the border of Panama. And so you've got the Bribris, the Barucas, and the Terabas, and those are the tribes that I've been to. And they're right there by the border of Panama. And interestingly, when we have visited, for example, the Bribris right there on the border, we literally had to take a boat along the border of Panama to get to their villages. And then we would ask them, well, how do you find people to marry, people to date, right? Because these are not very big communities. And what they said is they would walk into Panama. There are tribes there as well. So most years, our itinerary has included a visit to an indigenous village, and most likely your year will be the same. Let's talk about religion in Costa Rica. We've probably already mentioned, maybe at one of our pre-departure meetings, that Costa Rica would be considered a Roman Catholic country, right? 47.5% of Costa Rica is Roman Catholic. And that's about the same as the percentage of Protestants in the United States. So we might say, look, Roman Catholic, that religion is really the predominant religion. The others are much smaller. We've got just about 20%, right? 19.8% evangelical and Pentecostal. We've got a very small population of Jehovah's Witnesses and some other Protestant religions. And then ones that just fall into other categories, 3%. So this really is a Roman Catholic country. And that is one of the reasons I've said when you look around and you see people dressed, especially the older populations, the older ladies, maybe in my age bracket, a little bit older, they're very conservative. This is a conservative culture, and it probably stems from a population that's highly religious. Now, that doesn't mean we're not going to see younger people dressed more modernly like we might in the United States, but again, we want to respect the culture and dress in a way that makes it appropriate no matter where we are and no matter what our activities. If we look at the population again of Costa Rica, we see something really interesting here. So This is called a population pyramid, and a population pyramid shows us the age distribution. So right in the middle, and I know it's a little small, you see the age groups. So the youngest one is 0 to 4, then 5 to 9, then 10 to 14, then 15 to 19, and so on, right? And then each of those age groups has a bar. And the length of the bar, I guess I should say width of the bar, tells you the percent of the population. So let's just make sure we can read this. And notice males are on the left and females are on the right. So if we're looking at the age group of 0 to 4, you see what's going on there. This is the percentage of the population. And again, but that's of the female population and the male population. So this gives us a sense of, is this an old population or is this a young population? Well, where do you see the most weight? You see the most weight in those ages, right? In the 20 to 24, 25 to 29, 30 to 34, 35 to 39, and then it starts to very quickly taper in, right? So you see it tapering in those directions. And that makes sense, right? As you get to older and older ages, you're not going to have that many people. The top of the pyramid is going to be the narrowest, right? There's not going to be many people between 100 and 100 and whatever, or 90 to 99. But what this tells me is that this is a pretty young population, because the broadest part of the population is in those youngest, kind of those young in the 20s age groups, right? Maybe people that are just, 10, 15 years older than you. So to make this a little clearer, let's compare it to the United States. And when we compare it to the United States, what do you see? So look at Costa Rica, and it's got that big hump in the people in the 20s and the 30s. But now look at the United States, and it's kind of squared off, right? Squared off. In other words, we have more weight people in like the 40s and 45s and 50 and 55s and 60 and 65s, right? Because you've heard about the boomers, right? The boomers are retiring. They're now getting into those age brackets where they're on Social Security. You've probably heard that it creates all this pressure for Social Security. So is our population in the United States young? Well, no, because we've got all this weight of people in the 50s and the 60s, even in the 70s, right? But Costa Rica has all of, the bulk of its weight at the younger generations. So that makes Costa Rica probably a really vibrant, exciting place to be if you're young, right? But we know we have in the United States an aging population. One thing we do know about Costa Rica is that there are a lot of American expats, and this data comes from 2017, and I wasn't able to find anything newer that I thought was reliable. But it is true that many Americans call Costa Rica home. And after you see Costa Rica and the beauty, you're going to understand why so many Americans have decided to relocate to Costa Rica. So we're talking about Americans who have relocated to Costa Rica, and these are called expats, and specifically U.S. expats, people from the United States that have moved to Costa Rica, are referred to as gringos. So you might hear our guide refer to gringos. He's talking about the population of Americans who now have made their home in Costa Rica. It's actually almost 5% of the population, so that's pretty interesting. However, a bigger population of expats comes from Nicaragua. Now remember, Nicaragua and Costa Rica share a border, right? Nicaragua is the country to the north of Costa Rica. And that population is 6.7%. Again, not surprising. And it's really explained by disparity in standard of living, right? Same thing in the United States. We have people moving from Central America, Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, into the United States. And that's because they're seeking a better life. Access to jobs, for example, the coffee plantations. That is a place that's going to hire a lot of Nicaraguan labor. And those are jobs that Costa Ricans generally don't want to do. So Nicaraguans can move to Costa Rica, get access to jobs, and maybe a standard of living that's higher than what they will have at home. So as I said, this might parallel the United States and Mexico border situation with immigration. And again, we're not the only country that has problems like this, and Costa Rica might characterize itself as having problems with immigration and illegal immigration because they are one of the more prosperous countries in Central America. So let's quickly wrap up. We've clearly described a country that it's not surprising that it would be a popular destination for vacationers and expats. It's safe, it's beautiful, you've got mountains, you've got beaches, you've got rainforest and cloud forests, you can have an indigenous community experience. So the geographical diversity makes it a fantastic place to vacation, especially if you care about environmental protection and sustainability. It's got a diverse population with respect to race and religion, although we want to be clear there's a predominant religion and race, as we've said. And again, that's not unlike the United States. Costa Rica is a country that has seen struggles with population growth. And again, they've been a success story there. In our next lecture, we're going to turn our attention to the country's economy and eventually talk about how they have changed the composition of their economy through this peace dividend that we've talked about. So let me know if you have any questions, and thank you so much for listening. Have a great day.